Great. Well, thank you, Costa, and thank you, everyone, for a wonderful set of panels and discussions today. I think our job now is to, number one, keep you awake. Number two, get you really excited, because I think we have actually in front of you today as one of the greatest visionaries in the history of the energy transition.
We got to work on your standards.
With that, I'm so pleased to have Chelsea Sexton here with me. I think, how many of you saw the movie Who Killed the Electric Car? How many of you saw the movie The Revenge of the Electric Car? So Chelsea had a role in both. She spoke in the first one, and then the second one, produced the second one. In between, EVs became part of our everyday life, almost. And so I'd like to start by taking us back, I guess it was 1990, late 1990s?
Earlier?
Even before that, before electric cars were a household name, and most people were more concerned about air quality than they were about climate change. Tell us about your time working at Saturn, getting into the business of the electric cars. Today, she's working at the Loan Programs Office, and we're going to ask her about that too, but the ARC is important. So please take us back to the very beginning.
Yeah, so I started in the early 90s, actually, selling cars in a Saturn dealer purely to pay my way through school. I was not into cars, I was not into anything else, but I was a community college and then very humble state college student. It is the imposter syndrome of being on this campus is real. But I bought a little Saturn to take myself as a commuter to the San Fernando Valley in California to college and started working in this dealership, not because I cared so much about the cars, but it was really good money for a 17-year-old and lots of downtime for homework. That was it. And a few years into that, our finance manager rocked up and he's like, yeah, no, that electric car you keep geeking out that General Motors is gonna do, they're hiring people. And so I moved over pretty much by accident into that program in General Motors, drove one for the first time, discovered I like torque and horsepower more than anyone rightfully should, fell in love with that technology and what it could do and how it brought people to the table. And to Costa's point, pretty much have had my heart in the work ever since and have cobbled together the weirdest but coolest career based on like each little next thing I could slap myself into to move all of this forward. So I worked for General Motors for a bunch of years. When they killed that car, we did some protesting, some activism, some community organizing, a little movie making, formed nonprofits, and including the largest advocacy group for electric transportation in the US today, Plug in America. I did some work in venture capital. I advised a lot of car companies and utilities and governments around the world, all in spirit of moving all of this forward. I sort of suck at doing work I don't believe in, and that pickiness has worked really well for me. And then a few years ago, I got a random phone call from our director of our office, Jigar Shah, who's very well known in his own right, a bit of a rock star. Half my conversations start with, here's how I know your boss. Like, I know, me too. And he said, look, I've been listening to you for 20 years on EVs. Here's $40 billion that the office had at the time. Come put your time where your mouth is, and you don't have to move. So I and a whole bunch of others piled into the Loan Programs Office from wherever we were in the country. There's a lot of us that work remotely. And our entire job is to take all those lessons in skin knees and things that we saw that needed to be done in our respective sectors over the last few decades and apply it to the intelligent deployment of taxpayer funding in the form of loans. These are not grants, so we have to have a reasonable prospect of repayment, an actual business case, all of those sorts of things to help stand up the supply chains that we need for these clean energy technologies and deploy the energy projects, whether it's nuclear power or hydrogen, or I know that's a religion here, I learned that today, so we do hydrogen in this office, but also virtual power plants and microgrids for port electrification, sort of you name it. If it decarbonizes or increases fuel economy, it's generally in the realm of what this office does.
Well, this is phenomenal, and honestly, it sounds like you've moved from like one dream job to the next, but very, very different jobs and roles. And so given that arc of your experience, can you talk a little bit about what was effective in getting EVs launched and to the point now where we're seeing 1 in every 10 cars sold being an EV? So yeah, help us sort of understand which levers are most effective? What can we pull on to do this again?
Stubbornness. Yeah, I mean, electric vehicles are, certainly light-duty electric vehicles, are the only vehicles in the history of the automotive industry where the industry has always said, when we see enough demand, then we'll think about doing it. So, demand has always had to predate and continually exceed supply. So for 20 years, it was something where the advocates and the individuals and the enthusiasts and the happy warriors, maybe scattered throughout some of these organizations, companies and governments and academia, were sort of pulling the industries along. And that still is to varying degrees true, but we have a whole lot more support in both the federal government and state. I mean, the California Air Resources Board has been instrumental in instigating a lot of this and keeping it going, especially in eras where there would maybe be ebbs and flows in other forms of support. So it takes a village, so to speak, to kind of keep enough consistency to keep it all going. But it has been like a mind at a time forever, and now it sort of feels a little bit more like a rolling snowball. But I'm constantly the one going like, it's not time to go off on holiday yet. There still is a lot more work to be done. If today's conversations revealed anything, it's that it is much more complex than any of us have historically given it credit for. And like the bright, shiny newness of vehicle introductions and things, that ebbs and flows too, but we're in kind of that sophomore, junior phase of less bright, shiny stuff, more real work to be done. And that's where the grit really has to come in and where that stubbornness applies of just finding the wherewithal to keep going and keep pulling more people in to add to that momentum.
So really getting the chickens to outnumber the eggs for a little while. And then, I mean, if you've heard about the chicken and egg problem, this was something that, kind of plagued us in thinking about how do we accelerate technology transitions, where there's a big infrastructure component as well as a technology that needs to be developed. And so I'm curious, actually, just going off script or off road, maybe, if it fits today's, that was a joke, by the way. The question I had actually is in the, there was a time when hybrid, not the plug-in variety, but the off-grid hybrid vehicles were really outstripping, they're flying out of showrooms, right? And it was hard to get in line and get one of those vehicles. Did that help to create demand for electric vehicles, or was that sort of, is that an example of what you're talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I see gasoline-only hybrids as a little bit of a mixed bag, or certainly that first era of them. It got people thinking more about this sort of thing, and certainly the Prius era and sort of the conspicuous non-consumption became a psychological tactic. It also often led people to believe like that's enough, and I don't need to get an EV or a plug-in hybrid or do anything better, that like I have my Prius and all is good. So there's a bit of a mixed bag there, but certainly that, each little incremental thing is important. And I am not remotely a purist. I am still a big believer in really well-electrified plug-in hybrids. A bunch of us in my case, before DOE got together and helped convince CARB to put a 50-mile minimum requirement on any plug-in hybrids. They get credit starting in 2025. Those types of policy things are important as well, because if we only think pure EVs for the entire country in every use case, that's not going to grow electrification as quickly as having multiple options, including in medium heavy duty, hydrogen and other things, so that people can adopt what makes sense for them first. Some people find plug-in hybrids to be training wheels. Some people never grow beyond that. Like my mother loves her Volt. She'll probably never get a pure EV. I don't care. 90% of her miles are electric, and I care more about her first 90% than her last 10%. So we also need to be thinking strategically in that regard too, of like, what is the goal and what's gonna get us most quickly to that goal, even if we're starting with the first 90%.
Really insightful. I would, for sure. I think as we look ahead, I mean, we still have a long road ahead of us to get to the types of scales to really make a dent in decarbonization of the transportation sector writ large. I mean, we are well on our way, but what will it take to get that next order of magnitude globally or in the US, and where should we be directing our stubbornness?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it has been covered today, the complexity of not just thinking about cars. One of my overall concerns in a lot of the conversations is the interest to make future mobility behave like past mobility. It has to do the same things. It does not have to do it in the same way. You still need to get to work and school and play and everything else, but no one says you have to do it in your own personal, private, 3,000, 5,000 pound car every single day. 3,000, like they don't even come anymore that small. You know, your personal car every day versus bikes and buses and walking and, you know, all of the other things. So, you know, we've talked a lot about tearing down silos and joining the, you know, the housing conversation with the mobility conversations. It is still way too siloed. We are a spectacular circular firing squad. So I've always found it important to try to just find the coalition of the willing wherever they lie and get those people into the conversation first, and you pull the other ones along, because the perfect versus good thing is also really real. It's as bad or worse than chicken and egg, in that there's so many people that don't even want to start doing anything until we've thought through every unintended consequence and everything is perfect and all the stars align. And there's a place for that, depending on the risks, but there's more risk in not starting the conversation and not starting some action and the things that we can agree on and building on that.
Great. Yeah, I think that's also a really important lesson for our students to hear as well. I mean, early on in your career, you know, this idea that the perfect could be the enemy of the good can really potentially stymie progress from what you're saying. So I appreciate your raising that. I know, you know, if you talked about kind of looking for new ways, and also, you know, Costa mentioned moving people without necessarily increasing, you know, energy requirements, vehicle miles, helping people get where they need to go. Can you talk a little bit beyond passenger vehicles as well? Like where else can we electrify? What are some of the untapped opportunities that can help us expand demand?
I mean, when it comes to transport of people or goods, we should be looking to replace fossil fuels with electrons wherever possible, whether those are hydrogen-based electrons or battery-based electrons, but that's generally the goal. So cars, trucks, buses, but also like street sweepers and mining equipment and construction equipment. I mean, Norway has an interesting conference every year that I often go to on my own dime because it's that useful, but it's where I go to see the conversations that we'll be having in 5 or 10 years because they are that far ahead of us. And every single year I go, they've said like a new thing has to be zero emission now. So it started with like taxis, and then it became buses, and then it became the municipal stuff, the street sweepers and things. Last year it was construction equipment. So all construction has to have zero emission forklifts and backhoes and all of those things, and they just keep nudging it along, and they're able to do so, but it also helps tech transfer and policy transfer to other areas, which is part of my personal interest in it. But that is the goal here, is like, where can we find a niche and start replacing those fossil fuels with something else?
Amazing. Yeah, and in case you missed it, Norway is at the forefront globally in terms of electric vehicle adoption, and it's so exciting to know that, you know, going there gives us a whole range of new possibilities for what we could do with electrification here and in other parts of the world. So I'm looking at all of you because I'm going to be coming around 4 questions in just I think, couple of minutes to give you a chance to think about your tough questions. But I did want to just move on and talk a little bit more about your work at the DOE Loan Programs Office. What do you see as some of the biggest opportunities for this funding to transform our energy system and the vehicle technology space in particular, but just beyond that? And what are other exciting things happening at DOE that we should be aware of?
Yeah, I mean, ours is one of the interesting offices. There's a lot of offices doing really good work, but we have 4 or 5, depending on how you count them, loan programs that I decided pretty much apply to everything related to decarbonization, energy projects, and cleaner transportation. So I work obviously in the transportation stuff, no surprise there, and primarily on our manufacturing projects. And the interesting thing is that, you know, these programs were written generally in the mid to late 2000s. They didn't contemplate anything we're talking about today. My program is best known for having financed Tesla back in the day, but also Ford and Nissan, and very private personal car oriented. Today, almost none of those conversations are vehicle. They're all supply chain. Most of our interest is in batteries and lithium and graphite, because we can process critical minerals, and wiring harnesses and silicon carbide wafers for microchips for solar or transportation. And so I like that very much. It's not to say we'll never finance another vehicle, but you know, the notion that everything we're talking about today needs those building block components, and those are the supply chains we're standing up, not only de-risks these projects on behalf of the taxpayer, because they're not dependent on any single vehicle model doing well. Everyone's going to need it, and so will the mining equipment and the forklifts and whatever all are going to need these technologies. But we're very we're private industry led. So we don't come out and say like, we have this much money for batteries and this much for something else. We have X amount of money to provide in loans. And the industries that come to us and say, I'm ready for scale, because we only do commercial scale projects, sort of stuff that's ready for prime time, and then they prove their business case and we're able to finance on that basis. So it's really up to the stakeholders to kind of lead where a lot of these investments go, geographically, industrially, et cetera, based on where that interest lies.
That is super exciting. I just want to look around the room and see, first of all, do we have any students who would like to ask a question of Chelsea? Awesome. Okay, so we'll start in the back and work our way to the front.
Hecklers welcome. However, how interesting this remains depends on you guys.
I will not heckle. No, thank you for the talk. I appreciate it all. I was getting nervous when you were asking the previous question about like how the loans program, what's exciting about that. I'm curious about some of the drawbacks of that as a vehicle for funding a lot of the new work that's coming too.
What are the drawbacks of our funding?
Yeah, what are the drawbacks or like shortfalls of the loans programs, I guess?
High interest rates, loan sharks, et cetera.
Full of loan sharks, absolutely. I mean, you got to deal with me. That's probably the biggest drawback. I mean, we do not compete with commercial banks, but we operate like a bank. That is essentially what we are. We're just a public policy-driven bank, not a profit-driven one. We aim to have a successful portfolio, but we are here to lean into certain types of technological risk that, being a department of a bunch of nerds, we understand better and are more comfortable with than a commercial bank might be, and to provide what Costa mentioned, what our boss loves to call the bridge to bankability, to help support until other debt and later stage capital can help take over. So we don't deal with R&D or pilot or anything like that, but that we are there to help with that sort of early lift into where other sources can take over. That also means we're occasionally probably going to have a loan that doesn't work out. And we try to sort of rework them wherever possible, but there's a couple in our background that have been very well known. Folks have heard of Solyndra, it's not a secret. So there are those types of things that can happen as well. But that is the mission here, and why we've all piled into this office is to try to take that risk as intelligently as possible, but not so much that we're stymieing doing anything at all, that perfect versus good.
I think one thing that's really exciting now, and we were talking about this earlier, is that the DOE is kind of organized to be ready at each stage of technology development. So, I mean, all joking aside, I think there is a stage for each of these different types of, how patient is the capital, what's the focus, should it be grants? There's a lot of early stage research, TRL 1 through 3, that's getting funded out of different parts. So can you tell us a little bit more about that piece?
No, it's true. Pipeline? I mean, especially within the DOE, we have offices like ARPA-E that are very early stage, and we have, technologically or industry-specific offices, vehicle technologies, building technologies, that type of thing, that all have various grants. We're the only ones that provide loans. The rest of the offices provide grants, and there's a central landing page in DOE that you can go look at every source of funding we possibly have and sort of figure out what works for you. We, in our office, also function a little bit like the living room of DOE in some ways, because many of the other offices, when there's an open grant opportunity, they're not really allowed to engage with industry or anybody else quite as easily on a case-by-case basis. We are mandated to talk to everybody, and we are happy to. That's what we do all day. So we're also happy to sort of talk through, what's your project? Does it fit? We don't want you to waste your time if it's not ready for our office or one of our programs doesn't fit, but we might be able to help you find another one. And those types of things are all stuff that we provide to try to be of service to the companies trying to stand all of these projects up. But it's also very common for folks to start in one office with support and kind of graduate through them and sort of land with us at the end. I mentioned the wiring harnesses. It's one of my favorite projects we've done or offered a conditional commitment to. They make wiring harnesses in Texas, and it's weird and goofy, but like every vehicle needs one. And when the Ukraine war started, we watched multiple automotive facilities shut down because they could not get a wiring harness. And it's something that is a very manual process, very low-wage process, usually overseas, and these guys are the only company to stand up a manufacturing facility for automotive wiring harnesses in the US and to automate it. So they started with technology that originally got support from our solar office. And years later, they said, this thing that works on solar actually would work really well for this technology as well. And so that initial investment helped stand up an entire later stage project that we were able to finance.
Fascinating. Really, really neat success. Yeah. I think you had a question here in the front.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. My question is, I found a very strange phenomenon, like all the well-known EV brands were not traditional car manufacturing. Like all the traditional car brand were like very struggle to break into EV market, and very question why this situation will be like.
Why are automakers struggling to bring EVs to the market?
Yeah, like all the EV companies like Tesla, they didn't build a traditional car before. Yeah.
Yeah, Tesla versus everybody else. That's like an whole Fireside all by itself. I would say that Tesla is a unique situation and came about in a unique moment in time where there was simply less competition by those traditional automakers. It's also true that the traditional automakers have been somewhat perpetually ambivalent about wanting to succeed in all of this. Some of them are more into it than others, and they're all doing it to varying degrees because they need to. It's the future of their business. It's compelled by regulation. It's incentivized by policy. But they also make a whole lot of money from internal combustion vehicles, and humans are afraid of change. Like, we think about them as these like evil monoliths, but it's a bunch of humans that are worried about like, what does it mean for my retirement? And all of these sorts of really natural things. So pulling those companies along with the utility companies and the charging companies or the hydrogen fueling company. Like, there's so many stakeholders that have to kind of all come together. And we are that really good circular firing squad of like one will point at the other and say, well, when I see these 18 things, then I'll get on board, and vice versa.
Yeah, and I noticed another phenomenon, like all the countries that have high EV adoption rate, like Norway, like China, they all have industry policy to push in the EV to the market. Do you think the US will adopt a similar policy?
I mean, I think you heard cost to present that we have. I mean, there are quite a few incentives available for EVs, for medium heavy duty vehicles, for charging, for a variety of things in an effort to push a lot of this forward. There are different mechanisms than are used in Norway or parts of Europe or China and the places that you've mentioned. But I think you're right, many of the countries that are doing really well in electrification have figured out their flavor of trying to support it with policy. And I don't think we're any different. I think we're just keeping at it.
Yeah, thank you, thank you.
It's kind of an interesting analog on the national stage with China, to the company case where you don't have an incumbent technology. So in China, a lot of the automotive technology had come in from the outside, and so EVs were an opportunity to grow an industry from within, to sort of dominate.
Oh, there's
in that
definitely
space.
competitive stance here, for sure.
Yeah, and I would love to actually hear on the industrial policy side, as we're, and we'll ask for another round of hands in just a moment, but I wanted to pause and ask about the supply chain piece of this too. But how is that going? Trying to think about building EVs for the next generation of American car buyers here in this country with components sourced all the way up to the lithium, refined lithium in the batteries.
Yeah, I mean, it's been interesting to watch because we started, these conversations started before the IRA, and we were already seeing quite a bit of industrial interest in standing up domestic supply chains, primarily to address supply chain vulnerabilities. We're coming out of COVID, Ukraine, where I mentioned, there's a variety of things that just created a whole lot of bottlenecks in supply chain availability. So more and more companies have started to say, like, I need my personal gigafactory, one in the US, one in Europe, one in Asia, and that sort of thing was already happening. But of course, the IRA policies and the domestic content requirements for some of the tax credits have absolutely accelerated that interest and have provoked more interest up the supply chain. So it's no longer just about the cells and modules and packs, but also where's the lithium come from and the graphite, and those feedstocks to the entire vehicle or process is much more of a conversation for sure.
Great. I think we'll take another couple questions from the audience. Let's see, right here in the middle, I saw your hand first, sir, and then we'll go to you.
So I think we're in this cycle, this is just my personal observation, to where, we had small beer manufacturers and small car manufacturers at the turn of the 19th century to the 20th century, and then they got consumed and consolidated. And now we're back to microbreweries again, and it's not Budweiser and Coors. And now we've got a whole bunch of small manufacturers beyond Tesla. I mean, Rivian, Polestar, you name it. What other innovations are coming out of that? With this increased amount of competition, what other innovations have you seen peripherally to that? So when NASA goes into space, they invent Tang, right? Are there things like Tang that are coming out of the development of this technology?
I would say, what other innovations are coming out of the competitive landscape of, especially some of the smaller automakers trying to compete with some of the bigger ones? I would say the two things we've seen so far, one of them came out of Tesla, besides charging stations, which aren't new, but they did it well from a marketing standpoint, no question. But the over-the-air updates have been pioneering. And the thing that has been underestimated about those over-the-air updates is the degree to which Tesla has conditioned its customers and therefore the EV buying public to expect their car to grow with them. They expect their car will do something tomorrow that it didn't do yesterday. And I see a lot of the incumbent automakers are that's not their natural habitat to try to deploy that sort of thing. There are also some potential risks we need to keep an eye on. I mean, changing the way your vehicle drives in an over-the-air update, there's some implied consent kind of issues that, like, my car drives differently than it did and I didn't know that was gonna happen. Those are definite safety issues that may come into a larger conversation at some point, but that's certainly one of them. The other thing that I've seen is it's less visible in the market, but I think it's really interesting and underestimated so far, and that is the degree to which companies like Lucid have really pursued efficiency, getting that motor size down, getting that drive time to be more efficient, essentially getting out of this larger mid-size luxury car the efficiency of a Nissan Leaf. And the conversation so far has been like switching from like the cleanest gas car to the piggiest EV is still a better switch. But we do need to also consider the efficiency of those better cars over time. Like right now, go buy a Hummer if you have to, if it gets you into something with a plug, preferably the Hot Wheel version, but any EV is a good EV, but we do need to also think about making them better over time. And so the companies that are focusing on some of those things are also really fascinating. Whether or not they survive as companies, different question, but there's some really interesting technologies that's being pursued by many of them.
Excellent. And you had a question here in the front?
So acknowledging that we're in this process of mass adoption of EVs and pushing forward policy, supply chains, and there's so much work happening, I'm curious from your perspective, having worked so long in this space, what do you see on the maybe mid to long-term horizon? Is there anything you are thinking about as this system evolves over time? And one idea I'd just love to hear you talk about is driverless vehicles. Is that something that you see on the horizon, or is that just another Silicon Valley fad?
I fully recognize where I'm sitting at this very moment when I say, maybe not so much in light-duty vehicles. Where we go in the mid to long term is really more dependent on all of you than it is on me. I can tell you what I would like to see, and that is a lot of what the conversations that were happening earlier today. Practically speaking, after 30 years, the least interesting conversation to me on the planet is how do we sell another Tesla or another light-duty vehicle. A very interesting conversation for me is all the hard stuff. How do we do goods movement? How do we do freight? How do we get people out of personal vehicles even part of the time? How do we give them more attractive options? Like, shame is a terrible marketing tactic. The way to get people out of their cars is to give them better, more attractive, safe-feeling options. You guys all know this better than I do. That is where I want to see this conversation going, as well as pulling in the housing people so it's not so siloed of, EVs versus housing. It really can't be that way. It needs to be yes and. That's where the conversation needs to go. But we need more people piling into the party to help drive that conversation.
Other questions from the audience? Yes, Ed Rubin right up front here. A distinguished professor in mechanical and engineering public policy.
I couldn't resist. I wonder if you could talk about, I'm Ed Rubin from Carnegie Mellon, good to meet you. Can you talk about the potential need for different types of policy drivers to push innovation? All of the policy drivers, most of the policy drivers we've talked about today, and the wonderful measures that Costa talked about. When I think about policy, I think about carrots and sticks, right? My experience is that people generally prefer carrots to sticks. And right now, thanks to these new laws, we have a huge bag of carrots. But the slides that Costa showed indicate that it's not going to be enough to get us to where we want to go. If we really want to get to net zero in the next 20 or 25 years, we need to move faster. And so can you talk about the potential need for sticks? Sticks basically means requirements as opposed to incentives that could come in various forms, performance standards. My sense of the history of environmentally driven activities is that if you're in a hurry and you have ambitious goals, carrots alone ain't going to get you there. Do we need more sticks, and if so, what kind?
Yeah, do we need more sticks and not just carrots? I personally think there's a place for both. Obviously, I'm not in a position to set either kind of policy at the moment, but I come from a long history of watching sticks start all of this. EVs are here today because the California Air Resources Board back in 1990 demanded that they exist and continue to mostly, except for a few years in the middle, hold firm on that. And it was based on, like, if you sell X many cars in the state, then you have to make a certain percentage of them zero emission. They've evolved to a credit system. But either way, you either have to earn those credits yourself by deploying those vehicles, or you buy them from somebody else, which frankly is also how Tesla has survived as long as it has. They survived initially by selling credits to certain other automakers that were less interested in making their own EVs. And that paradigm staying as firm as it has for as long as it has absolutely provided the core stability to moving this forward that has been enhanced by all of the recent policy in the federal government and those sorts of things. But over the last 30 years, no matter the ebbs and flows, and sometimes the center of gravity was California, and sometimes it was federal, and sometimes it's been both, which is amazing, that combination is still incredibly required. And in the last few years, I've been really heartened to see the number of other states that have piled onto California's policy, because all the other states have the option of going one way or the other, and they can somewhat pick and choose from the menu. We like California's policy on that, but maybe not on this. So there's about 15 to 17 states that now adopt at least some of California's EV policies and advanced transportation policies, including now advanced clean truck standards. They're working on advanced clean fleet and clean miles standards to address all the Ubers and Lyfts in the world. And those, piece by piece, they're just addressing all the different use cases. So that advanced clean trucks policy is one of the things that I'm very excited about to help move the medium heavy duty vehicles into zero emission territory.
Exciting and good lessons for our budding policy analysts in the audience. I think go back and study California Air Resource Board.
There's this movie you can see.
And exactly, you can even watch it on a Friday night with your friends. And
it's all over YouTube, it's free, sometimes it's Netflix,
Who killed the electric car? So, how are we on time? Okay. Excellent.
Thanks for the opportunity for a question, and really thanks for your leadership in electric vehicles way before even the Department of Energy. And I'm hoping that the audience understands that one of the reasons that we even have an electric vehicle industry in the entire country is because of Chelsea's leadership over many decades. And that normally when I make my family watch Netflix movies about energy, they groan and they complain, but we watched both of the electric car movies many years ago, and they loved them, right? So we are grateful to have Chelsea here. I wonder if you can give us some insight of, in the loan program office, are there things, companies or aspects of the construction that you all are financing that have gone faster than you thought, or things that went slower than you thought? What's surprising you there in the way that these companies are responding to the loans that are available?
Yeah, I mean, we still do a shocking amount of outreach. I mean, it feels like we've been beating this drum now for a few years and that like no one's not heard of us, but the lack of awareness that we exist and that we have, depending on the program, you know, we've got a few $100 billion of capital to deploy in the form of these loans. So that just like making folks aware that we exist and that we are, you know, reasonably accessible. It is still a rigorous process. Some folks are more or less prepared for that. And then there's a lot of like, oh, you just write us a check and that's all we have to do. And of course not. Of course we're doing deep diligence on all the projects. We require community benefits plans. We encourage community benefit agreements. We do all of the things. So I would say the preparedness is where things often go faster or slower than folks may have expected. But overall, just the lack of awareness is weirdly one of the hurdles that remains and why we just run around and keep on telling the story. And some folks we talked to, you know, 3 years ago, and they're like, no, we don't need you, we're fine. And now like they do slowly start to come back and go, but actually a treasury rate loan doesn't sound so bad. So it's just one of the tools in the box, but it is one that we're continually trying to socialize as well as be a vehicle for the other programs that don't have the outreach team. We have 50 people in our office that do nothing but tell the story and talk to potential applicants and interested people all day, every day. The other offices don't have that. So we also try to serve whatever we can in that function for them as well.
Great, and because I think Costa teed it up nicely, do you have, I mean, if you can say, any sort of on your wish list for, say, future policy or anything that would sort of drive attention and opportunities to your office? Are there things that you would say, these are kind of right at the top of my list?
Well, you said, yeah, so those are two different things. So I will express a personal policy wish. I would like to see far more robust and consistent standards for public charging across the country. Ratepayer, taxpayer, settlement funding, because Electrify America is settlement-based, and so was EVgo originally. Every single one of them is slightly differently composed between each utility and each state and energy commissions and the federal government. None of it is consistent, and the charging providers are all playing whack-a-mole, trying to do basically what the minimum requirement in every single place. So I would like to see more robust standards across the board that are consistent and really drive the reliability that the drivers want. They are so frustrated, they're wrapping chargers in caution tape. This is not okay, especially when we're all throwing lots of public money at it. So that's just Chelsea's personal policy wish. I'd also like us to explore from the equity side some strings attached to that. If you're getting ratepayer or taxpayer money, maybe you're compelled to provide subsidized electricity in public places for low-income consumers and things like that. So we've not really got very creative in how to knit these things together so that they further all of the goals rather than just like each little one trying to tackle its own thing. In terms of stuff that I would like more of in our office, we see a lot of the battery supply chain. We don't see a lot of efficient electronic components, things like that. So I would say that more variety, more diversity in our pipeline would be super attractive. And that does include more medium heavy duty stuff. The combination of the infrastructure bill and IRA took us from being a light duty program only to adding medium heavy duty vehicles, on-road vehicles, in 2022. This year we are adding aircraft, maritime, and rail. So we're very excited to start working on some of those sectors as well. But we want to diversify the pipeline anyway, because there's a point at which we joke about, like, not another gigafactory, be a great problem to have, like not another lithium project, but we would like to not only do gigafactories and lithium projects. And then same thing on the deployment side. We'd love to see some, port electrification projects and microgrids and a lot of those types of things, more virtual power plants. We announced our first loan for that, $3 billion loan for residential-based virtual power plants, but there's a lot of other flavors that they can come in. And so a lot of those, cool energy deployment projects we'd like to see more of.
Awesome. I have to ask then, because I know hydrogen has been a topic that's come up. Are there, especially when you mentioned this whole interoperability of standards and availability of fuels and driver clarity and so forth. I mean, are there lessons that we should learn for deployment of hydrogen in transportation from the EV transition?
Well, certainly there are some reliability issues with hydrogen infrastructure for transportation, at least. Like there's certainly a difference between the hubs and the end stage. But sitting in California, as I do, we have a fair number of hydrogen stations. We also just had Shell pull out of the market. and we've seen all the reliability issues. So there's a place for it, but whether it's hydrogen or EVs or anything else, I am a huge proponent of trying to learn from the skinned knees of others, and California skinned a lot of knees. I mean, starting in 1990 with the original ZEV mandate, there's a lot of experience there and in other states and by certain utilities. Like, we should be running around trying to get all the data we can. And I am shocked at how often I will call somebody up and be like, you've been investing in this for 20 years. What's your lesson learned? And they're like, we don't know, we don't track that. Wait, what? So I would say right tool for the job also. You know, we also have had this tendency of like trying to pick a technology and making it the hammer for all nails. And there are certain things that the hydrogen excels at. There are certain things that maybe batteries are better, and being clear, and that those things also may shift over time, by the way, but being clear-eyed about what's viable today and folding in the next viable thing tomorrow is how we get all of this going versus waiting for everything to be ready to start anything.
So learn from the past, and yeah, skinned knees are good experience. Great. Well, I think Daniel, do you have? Great. One more. We'll take one or two more questions, please.
Okay. Thank you for the conversation so far. This has been really great. So earlier today, we've heard a bit about equity, particularly around engaging the community and community benefits agreements. We didn't really hear a lot about supporting diversity within the businesses themselves. And so I'm wondering if there are specific considerations within your loan programs to support BIPOC-owned businesses in particular.
Yes, but I would say there's not a particular statutory requirement. It is definitely one of the things that we are interested in, both from a sort of community benefits that includes internal communities, but also from a risk standpoint. I mean, we look at the risk of all of our projects through a reasonable prospect of repayment lens, from a likelihood of completion lens, and certainly one of the things we look at very hard is the management and leadership of the company, as well as its major partners. And so while it's not a hardcore, you must have X percentage type of situation, we get a little nervous when we don't see a robust enough team and internal culture that is likely to lead to success. And we are always looking for ways to mitigate risk, and that occasionally becomes one of the conversations we have.
Great. Other questions? Yes, Daniel.
I have a question, and I think this question might be relatable by a lot of people in this room if you live in Pittsburgh. I would love to own an electric vehicle, but I don't have a driveway. I don't have a garage. Pittsburgh was built before the car was the dominant mode of transportation. So I'm wondering if there's anything coming out of the loan programs office, in your office specifically on vehicle technologies, to help address this problem, because I don't really understand how I'm ever gonna own an electric vehicle and be able to confidently charge it at my home if I don't have either of those two things that most people who have electric vehicles have.
Yeah, no, it's a very fair, I mean, part of it's a policy question. What do we do for everyone that can't charge at home? For whatever reason, they can't charge at home. And you asked about what we're doing in our office. We obviously aren't a policy setting office. We can finance the deployment of public charging, and we have a few applications in that vein that may ultimately benefit you. But I think also, we've had this habit in recent years to focus the entire conversation around charging around the fastest public charging, which is both the most expensive charging in the ecosystem, especially when we're asking people who don't have driveways and therefore often are the disadvantaged communities to rely on the most expensive charging. It also is often the least convenient charging. The goal for most EV drivers, most of the time, barring an occasional road trip, is that charging is something that happens in the background of you living life. We shouldn't be standing there watching our cars charge any more than we stand there and we watch our cell phones charge. You plug it in, you walk away, you do something else. That could be at your home at night. It also could be at your workplace or your grocery store or your kid's soccer field or wherever else your life is happening. And reorienting the conversation to promote more of that level 1, level 2 AC, slower speed, but more affordable and accessible charging, and more reliable in some cases, is really important. So our Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Office just yesterday started to release some data on this. It's all over LinkedIn if you head over there. Some of us reposted it, so it's easy to find, that specifically tries to reorient this conversation. It reminds me of the graphics that everyone does around like how many people you can move in private cars versus a bus versus trains, whatever. It's that same situation. It just happens to apply to charging, how much more of it is out there than people realize. And then because I know we've had some transport folks in the room, one of the weird lessons we've learned in the last 30 years is that people drive past chargers every single day that they don't realize are there because there are no signs on the highway. Now, like, next rest stop, there's a gas station, nothing about a charger. Every single charging site in a Target parking lot or wherever looks different. So people drive past them all the time, but they think that box is what they're supposed to use to fill the air in their tires and not charge their car. You drive past a gas station, it doesn't matter if it's Shell or Chevron, you know it's a gas station. We don't have anything like that for charging. So some of the cheapest, cheerful stuff we could do is more signage. And it gets dismissed because people go like, all EV drivers have apps. The signs aren't for EV drivers. They're for people that don't yet have EVs and therefore don't know apps exist and may not want to have to go look up on an app whether they're going to be able to fuel their car. So making the charging that's out there more reliable but also more visible in ways that are a whole lot more economical than deploying more chargers is also part of the like lessons learned, skin knees, what can we do to move this forward? Some of them are hard, some of them really aren't.
That really feels like low-hanging fruit as well. So,
You would think
yeah.
so, but I've been telling this story for 30 years. I'm a little impatient.
Keep that stubbornness up. We gotta. I mean, people in this room, I think, are going to be, hopefully, can help us get that sorted out.
This whole thing has been homework.
Yeah, right. Exactly. We'll assign it in the next introduction to civil and environmental engineering, or engineering and public policy. Great. Well, I have another question. We do have a little bit more time. Okay, fantastic. But I want to just make sure we've got all of our audience questions. This is really a fireside chat that aims to be inclusive, and so we want to make sure we get all the voices in.
Thanks so much for sharing your experience, your passion definitely shows. And say hi to Jigger Shaw from Carnegie Mellon, of course. I guess the basic question I have is, do EVs have a weight problem? So with passenger vehicles, I'm worried there's this trend where Americans like things big, and that means bigger batteries. Ways auto manufacturers are reaching their range limits, and assuaging range anxiety is just making bigger batteries. But that leads to more tire wear, more maintenance, more damaged roads. Even with medium heavy duty vehicles, regulations have been laxed so that they can get another 2,000 pounds in gross vehicle weight, so the adoption can happen. From the loan office standpoint, energy density, you mentioned efficiency with Lucid. Are there efforts, or is this a problem for later kind of thing?
Do EVs have a weight problem? Because the batteries always make them girthier. I would say from a loan office standpoint, this is not a point of authority. From a Chelsea standpoint, I would say all vehicles have a weight problem. The fact that we are increasingly climbing into nothing but bigger and bigger vehicles that are inherently heavier, and then we start adding some batteries to them, we have a sort of a problem across the board. Some of that could be addressed by policy, some of it is certainly addressed by market demand, but the flip side of where I started, which is for 100 years the auto industry has insisted that demand predates supply in EVs. They never required the same thing for SUVs or trucks or anything like that. That was like, hey, we have this thing, don't you want it? Let me push it towards you, that kind of thing. So it's a self-inflicted wound to varying degrees, but there are ways out of it if we decide we want to. I have been heartened by some realization that some of the better selling cars are actually not the biggest ones. The fact that Hyundai Kia is doing so well, to be clear, they're not tiny cars, but they're more mid-sized crossovers than some of the larger things. That's led to other automakers saying, you know what, we might actually explore some cars again. Ford came out last week and said that. So I think some of those data points are heartening, but that we have to do a lot more to push it. I've seen cities around the world, increase taxes on heavier vehicles. There are certain ones that are trying to keep some of the largest vehicles out of their country, EVs or otherwise. So that's kind of an ongoing conversation, but I don't think it's a slippery slope that we can afford to not try to address. It's just not technically within my office's purview to single-handedly address it.
Great. Any further questions from the audience? Yes, I see one in the back.
Thank you for your time and the fireside chat. So I think you were initially talking about the evaluation part, and you were saying how some applications are true and some are not. So can you throw some more light on the evaluation process, and what are the kind of applications that are generally taken in at the loan program office?
More about the loan evaluation process?
Yes.
Yeah. So we start with eligibility, obviously, in all cases. Some of the programs, it's really straightforward. I can tell you from the first conversation if it's going to be eligible. Some of them require a little bit more digging. Some of our programs have an innovation criteria that's not immediately apparent. But in any case, we start with that, technical eligibility, and then financial, and then viability. So eligibility first, viability second. Viability is financial viability. Is it a business plan? Have you raised any equity? Because we cannot finance 100% of any project, so you're going to have some skin in the game. Is it technologically viable? Is it, an appropriate technological readiness level? We are hard 8 and above, nothing before that. We cannot finance pilot facilities and things like that. Is it commercially viable? Is there a market for it? How are you proving to us there's a market for it? Some of them are more obvious than others. Sometimes if it's a vehicle, that's a different thing than if it's a silicon carbide wafer, and that's a different competitive set, but we're looking at that. Is the project shovel ready? In the case of the manufacturing projects, we're financing a manufacturing facility, not the actual manufacturing. So do you have a site picked out? Do you have a contractor to construct it? Do you have any agreements in place? Have you chosen any equipment and tooling? Do you have any feedstock arrangements in place? All of these things are the type, and environmental, obviously, also, because every project that is supported by the federal government has to go through a National Environmental Policy Act review. There are 3 types. Some of them are more intense than others, but we have to be able to scope out and establish a baseline and which type of review will be required during diligence. So all of these are the types of things that we evaluate initially internally with our team and then ultimately during due diligence, with the benefit of external advisors that we hire. We hire an independent engineer, independent financial market advisor to provide their own independent analysis in addition to our team's conclusions. So all of that happens usually over the course of at least a year. Like, it's a robust process. So those are the types of things that are evaluated. And then also, obviously, the community benefits plans that I mentioned, they are required to be, some programs require them at applications, some they're developed along the way. Either way, you have to have one. It has to be approved before we close a loan and disperse any funding. I know that was a mouthful, but.
What's the average loan size?
Our average is probably somewhere 500 million or so. Our small ones are 100 million. Our biggest one so far is 9.2 billion. So it is a very strange thing for somebody like me that used to try to go from like 1 EV at a time to, I'm sorry, you only need 50 million. That's a little small for us. But that is kind of the reality of the situation. Not because there's a legal minimum, there's not. It's the practical minimum. It is that year's worth of work. And those independent advisors that we hire, they work, they provide the independent analysis, but they're paid for by the applicant. And the total cost of those folks, about $5 million. That doesn't amortize well over a small number. So generally speaking, we tend to get the bigger stuff.
Great. Yes. Okay. So I think we're getting close to time to wrap up. If there's one more quick question, we can take it. Otherwise, I have one. Yes, we have one more here in the back.
Yeah, real quick. I'm just curious. Do you think that maybe our reach has exceeded our grasp when it comes to EV, that we've pushed it so hard that now when the unintended consequences show up, they get accentuated to where you're seeing a market pullback now, whether it be fire or range or ability to get charging. Do you think maybe we went too far too fast? And the other thing is, when you're investing in batteries, do you worry about we're in the 8-track tape range right now, and we're about ready to go to digital in the next 5 years, and isn't there some anxiety when people want to buy an iPhone and it's the iPhone 1 and you know the iPhone 8 will be here in 2 weeks, or you're going to lose your money in the investment? So how do you deal with things like that?
So have we grown too far too fast? I would say that after 30 years, it feels like the opposite. I mean, I'm thrilled for the progress we've made, but no, it has not been too fast. It's taken us 30 years. And we, from a decarbonization standpoint, from a climate change standpoint, if our reach isn't exceeding our grasp, we're doing it wrong. So I hear you on the unintended consequences, but we have to keep at it. We have to try to think through those in advance where we can and deal with them where we haven't seen them coming. So not dismissing those consequences, but again, we can't navel gaze to the point of doing nothing because not everything's gonna be perfect or without any skin knees. We just can't afford it. From the standpoint of like when we invest in batteries, are we worried about them being the 8-track? It's something that we evaluate every time. I mean, it is part of our evaluation process. It is part of that technological viability kind of analysis. Is whatever they're making compared to the term of our loan and what they're proposing to deploy it for likely to be overtaken by another technology in that time or sometime after? Yes, we pay attention every single time. Will we be able to guarantee against it every time? Probably not. But especially in the case of batteries for EVs, there's this aspect that like it feels like it's moving really fast and graphene and solid state and silicon anodes and all these things. The reality is it moves much more slowly, especially in the automotive industry, which is really conservative when you start putting this technology in a 5,000 to 6,000 pound vehicle and giving it to somebody to run around on a freeway. They're really concerned about making sure they're fully validated. So chemistries and technologies are not changing that much that fast that it's a significant risk, but it is still one that we pay attention to.
Excellent. Well, I think just to close things out, I have a serious question and I have a less serious question. You can choose to answer one, both, or neither. So first of all, I guess for those, especially our young scholars and aspiring entrepreneurs in the audience, the Department of Energy defines a clean energy champion as a person or a group that takes action to support or join the transition to a clean and renewable energy economy with the knowledge that reducing carbon emissions provides daily benefits to Americans so they can live happy and healthy lives. So you, I think, embody this definition of a clean energy champion. Can you offer some advice for our emerging and future clean energy champions in our audience today? And my non-serious question is, what's the next movie?
Oh, well, our director would love to make a third movie, but we'll see. So all I can say is sort of TBD. On the clean energy champion front, I'll say what's worked for me and what I would encourage, which is not the only answer. Obviously, I've mentioned persistence a bunch of times. I think that's really important. I suck at a 5-year plan. I never had, this is what I'm gonna be when I grow up. I stumbled upon EVs accidentally. I was just smart enough to realize how much I love them and to try to cobble together this weird little career. So I do, everyone says follow your heart and stuff. It's a little dorky, but if you can find a thing that you genuinely like and can make a living at it, that's useful. But also part of what enabled me to have this cool little career is open-mindedness. Is not, if I had said I'm gonna be X, I would have missed the 18 things I actually did along the way, and taking just the next decision. Do you go to a protest and try to save an electric car? Do you start working on this in the first place? Do you help start this nonprofit? Do you do this thing? Do you do that thing? Each next step is what ended up paving the way. But if I had been too focused on just one thing I was gonna do, especially in such a nascent space where the opportunities really are all over the place and not necessarily as clear cut, I would have missed out on a lot. I think also we've heard a lot of all the different things in which we need more help. All the different vehicle types and modes and policy and regulation, but also marketing and signs and whatever you're interested in, there's probably a way to slot into this. And I see a lot of people sort of get in their own heads and think, well, I don't have this background, so therefore I can't do that. My degree is in Dept studies. I was gonna be a sign language interpreter when I found this thing at 20. So we all come from the weirdest of places, but not ruling yourself out of the game because of those types of things, we do have a tendency to get on our way a little too much. And then I would say just being game. The number of really amazing people that I have met in this industry that are just showing up going, I can help here, I can do that. Would this be helpful? Would this be useful? What can I learn? Let's have a conversation. That has been really, really key across the DOE experience I've had, but also the career. And every place I've been, those have been the best, bright, shiny stars that have also managed to succeed and help move this forward, is just showing up with that open-mindedness and that willing to be game and just jump in and move it forward and to try to not get burned out or figure out a way to not let it last, that persistence.
Wonderful. Well, I've learned so much. I think Chelsea is a role model for all of us and moving forward into the next phase of the clean energy transition. Thank you for sharing your accomplishments. Please join me in giving her a big round of applause.
Way too kind.